is basically because I became increasingly dissatisfied with the answers that we in Mexico, but Americans also, give to the questions we all ask ourselves about my country. Why, if we know what has to be done, do we not do it? Why, if we have done so much and achieved so much, particularly the last 15 or 20 years, are we unable to do the last leg, the last mile, and finally consolidate Mexico as a prosperous, democratic, middle-class society with less poverty, less inequality? We know more or less what has to be done, so why doesn't it happen? Well, I became increasingly dissatisfied with the answers which we have all been providing because, particularly silly answer, the Americans don't let us, maybe. Why don't they let us, or why do we care? Secondly, well, why can't we ponernos de acuerdo? Why can't we agree among ourselves what to do? That's why. Well, it's true, but that begs the question why we can't agree with among ourselves what to do. Well, the Mexican political elite lacks the political will to do what has to be done. True, but why does it lack the political will? And so on and so forth. The first one is Mexico's radical, extreme individualism, which may be a bit counterintuitive if you remember what you've seen in the murals and what you've read and you've seen in the movies and stuff of Mexico as a collective people, of people where everything is done together. No, we do nothing together. You cannot find two Mexicans who will cooperate on anything. Zip, nothing, absolutely nothing. Mexicans are far more individualistic and far less associative, collective than Americans certainly, but than most Latin Americans also. And this is not just because the classics say so, but because we have comparative figures that make this very clear. We have fewer Mexicans participating in labor unions, elections, philanthropy, associations, any kind of collective grouping, including religion. Mexico may be a very religious Catholic country, but it is an individual Catholic country. Mexicans are incredibly individualistic in their religiosity. You cannot find Mexicans who will do anything together. You can't find Mexicans who will live together. If you overfly a city like Sao Paulo or Buenos Aires, you see high-rises forever. Expensive high-rises, middle-class high-rises, cheap and horrible high-rises. You see all sorts of high-rises, but that's what you see. In Mexico City, you see none of this. You see miles and miles and miles of horizontal housing. Mexicans do not like to live in vertical housing, period. Why? Well, first of all, because it's not mine. This is a piece of air, which is obviously not mine. The only thing that's mine is a house, my house. And you can see it in the architecture of the cities, of all of the cities. And this is even more true today. In the last 10 years, we've had an incredible housing boom in Mexico. More than 5 million families, mainly low-income families, have been able to purchase a home. Small, not great, what have you. No trees, we don't like trees in Mexico. But a home, 5 million. More than 80% are horizontal. Only 20% are vertical. But this, which is important, can be accompanied by something which is not important, or actually it is, but not as significant, which is the national tragedy we live in Mexico every 4 years when the soccer World Cup takes place. And this is something which plunges us into deep depression every 4 years, and rightly so. We should be depressed about it, and we are. Because we simply are terrible at any collective sport. We are incapable of doing anything together. In individual sports, we're not that bad. We've had outstanding tennis players, boxers, golfers, sprinters, some walkers, whatever they're called, swimmers. Of course, we have fantastic bullfighters, which is an individual sport par excellence, but we are disastrous at collective sports. We have won 54 medals in the Olympic Games since 1900, 47 of them in individual sports, 7 in collective. A second national characteristic which we have is that we cannot stand, we thoroughly dislike and reject conflict, contradiction, confrontation, and competition. We don't like this stuff. We don't want confrontation. But this doesn't work anymore. It doesn't work in politics, which is why the country is paralyzed, because we don't want to bring things to closure. And it doesn't work in the economy because we have an open economy. And so we end up with this ridiculous situation, which comes from the lack of competition, that we have in a country which is still not a wealthy country, the wealthiest man in the world. But he's not just the wealthiest man in the world. He is an especially wealthiest man in the world. 100 years ago, when President Roosevelt broke up Standard Oil, exactly 100 years ago, John D. Rockefeller was the world's wealthiest individual, and actually the wealthiest individual in the history of mankind, to the extent that we can measure how rich the pharaohs were or whatever. His net worth was roughly equal to 2% of US GDP of the time. Carlos Slim's net worth today is roughly equal to 7% of Mexican GDP today. So in relative terms, he's 3 times wealthier than John D. Rockefeller was before Standard Oil was broken up. But he also has a greater net worth than the next 20 Mexican magnates altogether. Put them all together, he's still got more. Now, what kind of competition do we like? Well, I picked up a story once from the New York Times, which made a point that we all in Mexico know, but we don't necessarily look at it the way the Times did. The Times article began by saying, if there were to be a Guinness Book of World Records of the country most obsessed with being in the Guinness Book of World Records, it would be Mexico. And then, of course, they gave some examples, and I started thinking about this, and of course, it's obvious. We have the world records we have. The world's tallest artificial Christmas tree. The world's largest ice skating rink. The world's largest taco and tamal, obviously, logically enough. The largest number of people simultaneously kissing each other in the same public space. And most importantly, because this is, especially in California, this is very important, just after Michael Jackson died, the largest number of people coming together and all dancing Thriller at the same time. These are all Mexican records in the Guinness Book of World Records. So then I asked myself, well, why? And I began to read what people have been saying about this. And one Mexican political scientist discovered the reason, very intelligent and actually very obvious when you think about it, a guy called name of Carlos Elizondo. This is the competition we like, competition without competitors. Because there is no other bunch of nuts in the world who are going to try to cook a bigger taco. It's not going to happen. Another obvious example is what many of us who grew up in Mexico remember very well as children, what we call in Mexico los concursos de oratoria, oratory competition. In the United States, in Britain, and in France, and other places, you have debating clubs and contests. 2 teams or 2 individuals debate, one against the other, and one wins and the other loses. In Mexico, we have concursos de oratoria. Each kid sounds off on his own, alone, and one after another, 10, 15, 20 kids, and then the teacher decides who was the best speaker. But there's no confrontation. There's no debate. There's no dialectic. It's each one on their own. Well, this doesn't work anymore in a market economy and a representative democracy. I ask myself, is there any way that any proof or any evidence that we can change the Mexican national character? Or is this something set in stone which will never change? And the answer I try to give is, well, we don't know, but we have a Petri dish real-time laboratory experiment going on. And we can now look at it and see what happens. And who are these people? Well, obviously, they're Mexicans in the United States.